Astralis are currently both the best Danish CSGO team and the best CSGO team in the world. And interestingly enough, they actually contrast quite well with what is the best Danish Counter-Strike team of all time, which was mTw back in their lineup that they put together in 2008, and that continued on into 2009. But 2008 particularly was the peak of their careers, when they were one of the best teams of all time. They were the best team of 2008. They won a major. They won the most titles that year. They actually won the first big, really competitive title of 2009 as well. They had a fantastic success rate against all their rivals of the era. They matched up against pretty much everyone, and it was in what, for my money, is the most competitive year of Counter-Strike ever played, including CSGO. Now, interestingly enough, the comparisons and the way you can contrast Astralis against mTw even starts with where the teams were before they made the key roster move that kind of set everything in motion to become the best team in the world, to become an all-time great lineup. So, for mTw, back in 2007, they were not under the mTw organization. They were actually under the NOA brand there, not to be confused with past NOA lineups that were very, very multicultural and were players from, Norway and United States and Canada. No, this was the NOA, which had transitioned to being purely a Danish lineup. There was no Norwegians left within it. And in 2007, as an NOA, they made a key roster move where they brought in a player called Sunder, and he became one of the best players in the team. And they got to an elite level. The year before, they'd been a team that, they could make like top 8. They could occasionally make a top 4, but they were never going to win a tournament. 2007, it all turned around and they became legitimately elite. Every big tournament they went to, they were contending for the title. And they made it to the final of 2 of the majors in 2007. They made it to the ESWC final, where they lost to Pentagram, which was Neo and Taz's team. And they made it to the World Cyber Games final, where they lost to Emulate, the French team, led by MSX, who had one of the craziest single, solo hard carry performances ever in Counter-Strike history to win that tournament and deny mTw the gold medal at the World Cyber Games. So I think that history of where they were before they became the best team in 2008 actually favorably compares with, or reasonably compares with, where Astralis were pre-Glaive, because they were in the past, when they were Dignitas under Fetish, and then when they were with Carrigan, okay, there were a lot more tournaments that they won. Like, the difference is, the NOA team didn't win titles. But when it came to the biggest tournaments, the majors, where you kind of get to see, like, what is the highest level of this team under the most pressure and against all the best teams, they were at a similar kind of level. Like, Astralis could make it to top 4 every time and lose to a team that might win the tournament, or they could beat the same team in another tournament, but not in the big major. They were just one player away from being a major champion so many times. Now, yeah, they had slumped a lot by the time that Glaive arrived there, but really, in the longer span of things, we're talking about since they were like Dignitas back in 2014, really the slump was about 6 months. That's reasonably about what they had a slump within. So before that, they had years where they were comparable to this NOA period, which admittedly was a year within the lifespan of the NOA later mTw team. So the key thing that happened was, in 2008, this NOA team, which then became mTw, recruited a player called Wimp. And Wimp was an all-time great player, probably the best Danish player in history at that point in time, but he was a player from the past. His prime had been when he was kind of a prodigy, a young 15, 16-year-old player in 2004 with a team called the Titans from Denmark, who won ESWC and made second place at the World Cyber Games. And he'd been a fantastically skilled player. It was kind of a prodigy, kind of a genius type player, skill-wise. But interestingly enough, since then, he'd been in some good teams, and some of the Danish teams had been pretty decent, but he'd never seemed like he was going all in again on Counter-Strike. He was playing in some lesser teams, and he was still a good player, but he wasn't having the same superstar individual impact on the game. So when they brought him into the team, it wasn't coming in as a superstar player. They were bringing him in mainly for his experience and his veteran skills, and to be someone who could team play and someone who had been a part of successful teams, and hoping that this would be the change that would make their kind of shore up their weaknesses and make them a more complete unit. Well, in this sense, this is what Astralis did, because Astralis was in a position where they tried everything with the current lineup they had. They had, on paper, the best lineup you could have from Denmark. Every person in each of their roles was definitely a contender for best in their role in Denmark, and usually among the best in the world at their roles. So they tried everything. They still couldn't get over the hump. So what they did is they reached back in history and they found Glaive. Glaive, a guy, okay, sure, heroic could come up a little bit, but this is a guy who hadn't been doing anything for years. It hadn't been since the early days of CSGO, when he'd been the leader of Western Wolves and had imposed that really good tactical style that had gotten the most out of star players, but also role players. They reached back for someone like that and said, let's give this guy a try. Let's bring him in for his own unique skill set. And so, interesting enough, both moves, even though they were different types of players for different types of roles, had this drastic effect on the team, not just in terms of what that player brought to the team, but then the impact of them being slotted into a role of the outgoing player and how other players in the team shifted their roles. And it was actually shifting the roles of multiple people that made one player being added have such a drastic impact. Because it wasn't like one player came and he just played really great and that's what won these teams the title and made them the best in the world at the time. No, what happened was, it was as if you'd had 3 or 4 roster moves, because other players within the team who weren't the replaced player or the arriving player actually swapped their role, sometimes quite drastically, and that has had the cumulative effect with the new addition of making them seem like a completely different team with only one player's difference. So when they brought in this player, Wimp, to MTW in early 2008, the player they were replacing was actually the star player of the team, one of the stars. The 2 star players of the team as NOA in 2007 were a player called HPX, who was an AWPer, and Sunder, who was the rifle player at the time. And HPX had been one of those classic, really good AWPers. Like, he wasn't a dominant Kogu fraud type guy, but he was just below that level. He was a very stable player, and the key thing was he was that kind of slow and steady tracking aim AWPer who you put on a spot and you know they're going to hold their angles and they're going to lock it off, and if multiple people attack them, they're going to get a lot of high percentage shots off, and they're going to always kill someone where it's the 6 or the 7 out of 10 degree of difficulty shot, and you can really rely on them to hold their spots and play in that particular sense. But in removing HPX, they took Sunder, who at the time had been a rifle player and was one of the better players in the team, and they made him the AWPer. And he wasn't that sort of skill set at all, actually. In fact, he wasn't a super good tracking aim AWPer, and he wasn't a good stable AWPer in that sense. And what they did instead was take Sunder's aim and his kind of twitch style of fast firing speed, and instead of leaving him out there like other AWPers who use that style and are very erratic and up and down, they put him in the context of the tactics so that his position of where he would be AWPing and which shot he was taking and where he'd fall back to was built into how the tactic would work or how the CT setup would work. And as a result, they were able to use his fast firing speed as an advantage tactically, so that they could get an early pick on someone, or so that when he was in a certain spot, he took the initial shot and then fell back to where the control group was, because he'd played some of the big sites in the past with Ave, and I think the other player he played them with was, let me think, Ave. I think Wimp was the other player who played the big sites. And so since Sunder had been a rifler, he kind of had a sense of how the big site was going to play as well. So they changed up how they used him in the team. Sometimes used him on the other sites as well. And so it was more how he was used tactically within the team. Now, interestingly enough, when I get to the Astralis example, there's even a parallel there. But in terms of the other players in MTW, Wimp coming in, okay, he technically replaced HPX, but it was actually Sunder who took HPX's AWPing. Now, Wimp came in and took up Sunder's rifle roles, and he played the team aspect within the sites where you have the 3 guys on the site, such as the A site on Inferno, and he took up a lot of supportive roles, and he was still a pretty skilled player, but he wasn't a star player, and he was just a fantastic team play guy, and a guy who had really good communication and understood what the in-game leader was trying to accomplish. Then they took a player called MJE, and they actually put him as the small site anchor on most of the bomb sites. So famously, the best example obviously was on the B site on Inferno, and he pretty much defined and became one of the most famous players ever for playing those small sites and playing that particular site, because that particular site and small sites in general are about being able to scout where the enemy is, be in a position where they don't instantly frag you, hold them off, kill a couple of them, play intelligently around them, come well, and then work with your guy so that he can rotate over. It was Zonic in the case of Inferno, to the other site and overload it, or he knows when to stay with you, and the 2 of you can hold up pretty well against 4 or 5 man attacks. And MJ actually became one of the best in the world at this, and Sunder became a very effective AWPer, and Wimp became one of the best team players in the world. And so The Astralis equivalent of this, in terms of what Glaive brought to the team, was, first of all, Device was already an AWPer, but earlier in his career, you go to 2014, you go to 2015, he's using the AWP in a hybrid sense. And he just uses it sometimes when he's feeling it, and sometimes on the same map, he just plays the spot with a rifle. And famously, when he would get to the big semis of majors and these huge tournament scenarios before they won as TSM, he would kind of just go by his own confidence. So if he didn't feel confident, he'd throw the AWP away, he'd get a rifle, he'd play a lot more safe, and as a result, he wouldn't have a star impact on the map when he's the guy who could have turned a lot of these games around and won them for his team and beaten out the Ninjas in Pajamas and the other top teams and maybe won his team a major. So what happened with Device then was Carrigan kind of came down and they reformulated the team, and he started trying to be a primary AWPer and do AWP all the time. And he was good at that, but they just put him out there like a superstar AWPer, and it's like he had choice of where to go and when to go places. And in doing so, he became a really good carry AWPer in 2016, and he'd have huge performances. I mean, famously, Train was a really good map for him in this sense. But the problem was the rest of the team didn't really work around him well, and he didn't work as well within the tactical system because he had a lot of freedom as to what he did. And it felt like that actually made him very good as an individual player, but his impact on winning a team around based on his AWP kills wasn't as good, actually. And so the difference is, with Glaive in Astralis, Sunder's AWPing takes on some of the quality... Device's AWPing takes on some of the qualities of what Sunder's did, which is it's entirely built within what the tactic is. So he covers a specific area where he locks it off, or he comes in not first on Train. He takes up an initial position on maps like Overpass and Train, and then as the others advance along the sites, then he comes in and takes a specific angle, or takes out a specific person, or duels a specific position. And as a result, the confidence aspect's irrelevant. He knows he's playing his role within a tactic, and you've seen him be set up to succeed, and he has succeeded quite a lot. And now, interestingly enough, they had very different firing styles. Like, I think actually Device is more of the tracking style in general. I don't think you see as many crazy flicks from him. His are more like he has it on the corner and then he takes a little flick, but it's not like a half the screen, like almost lock like you see from players like Guardian, etc. Now, interestingly enough, the player who I would compare to what happened with someone changing role entirely, so how Sunder changed his role and how MG changed his role, those players would actually be Dupree and Kirby. Because what happened was, Dupree gave up the entry role that he had been famous for so long, because he'd been in a slump in that in the summer of 2016. He gave up that role, he gave up those more aggressive aspects to Kirby. And now Kirby did this, and Kirby had actually been somewhat okay, but he hadn't been the star he'd been in Dignitas. He'd been somewhat muted in Astralis. Suddenly, this has opened up Kirby to be not the best player in the team, but a player who contributes heavily on a regular basis and whose consistent level now is a lot higher. And he seems like he understands what to do in the game, and with his he's got really good streaky but precise aim. And so as a result, like a Bialy, like a Kiyashima, you want him more on the other end of the map. You want him more on the aggressive end of it, where they're taking duels and using that fantastic first bullet aim to get crazy headshots and to open a map up for you. Whereas Dupree, a player who played the entry role his whole career pretty much in CSGO, moved back to a lurking role. Now, initially, he did that giving it up to Kirby. But actually, it's turned out that Dupree has started to thrive in this role. I mean, he always was someone who was good in clutches anyway. But now, it seems like he has good impact in general. His fragging's gone way up. Seems like he now feels like he fits within the identity of the team. And in fact, maybe because he was in a slump, the fact that he comes and he's doing a role that they need someone to do, like the MG guy moved over to the small sites, means he's thriving in it. Now, not to the same degree MG did, because he became probably the best small site player in the world at one point in time. But Dupree has massively improved during the time Glaive has been the in-game leader of Astralis. Now, not only in terms of the role swaps has MTW got some contrast points, some reference points with what Astralis is doing now, but even in terms of the balance of the team, because MTW Denmark were one of the most well-balanced teams in Counter-Strike history in terms of skill, but also roles. So in terms of skill, I mean, I defined kind of the roles before of what they had, but in terms of pure skill, they famously had 4 pretty strong players, 4 above-average pros in terms of skill, or 4 good players. So they had MG, Zonic. I mean, remember, Zonic had been a star player 3 years earlier. They had MG, was a pretty good player within his own context. They had Wimp, obviously had been a superstar in the past. and they had Sunder was one of the better players at this point in time. They had 4 strong players. Well, Astralis has 4 strong players. They have Device, they have Kirby, they have Dupree, they have Zipnix. Now, interestingly enough, both in-game leaders were actually players where I don't think as individual players they're that strong, but they're very good at fragging within their system, at being the in-game leader, at being an entry man and getting kills within their system. That's something both in-game leaders actually have shown a real aptitude for, because everyone's seen how good Glaive has been at that and how that has really revitalized the terrorist side play of Astralis. Well, people won't know this, but that was the case with Ave. He never had like crazy aim. He never had really fantastic skills, but the way he could get T-side kills with an AK and where he'd put himself in a tactic to enable the others to do well, but also sometimes get kills, was actually constantly deceptively good and was surprisingly impressive, actually. Something I always respected a lot. And so because of this skill set and the role balance, that's part of why they're so good at that grinding style of play, which both teams are now famous for, where you have a slow T-side that you grind on the opponent and you just call a couple of strats, and it's just the small variations that differ between them, and you're just trying to load them up so that it's the right time to do that strat, and then you're just going to execute from your default. And the reason why both teams can do that is actually in part because of this balance of skill in the roles. First of all, the roles mean that there's not some imbalance as to where you have to get the kills in the round to win. Like, it's not like the entry players are the better players in the team, therefore you have to get the entry kills, otherwise the whole round's lost. It's not like they've got the best clutch players in the world, so it doesn't matter what happens at the entry point, they can rely on that guy. They've got good players and players suited to their roles throughout the team, and that was the same in mTw. And as a result, that's what allows you to grind. Because first of all, because you've got the roles balanced, people can execute the tactic fully at all points in the tactic. Secondly, because you've got skilled players in more positions than 1 or 2, it doesn't matter if 1 or 2 players die. You're still dangerous, you can still execute, you've still got a skill set, a toolkit from which to work and find other solutions to the round. And so mTw were one of the best ever at grinding out games. And even if they lost, they were going to get to like 9 or 10 rounds in every game, it felt like, no matter what. And they would so often, even in losses, be right in there in the game at a 13, a 12 round game. You've seen this from Astralis in most of their losses as well. They're right there, they're giving themselves chances, and they don't always win, but they're so hard to beat in that particular sense. And that comes from not just the skill, but the skill distribution and then the balance of the roles. Now, another thing both teams are pretty good at, mTw probably the best ever at, is scouting the opponent and not just designing anti-strats, but looking for counters, as in within what you want to do and what the opponent does, finding the few areas that are the counters that allow you to open the game up. I mean, I remember watching a game, an NFL game years ago. It was in 2004, I think, and it was a regular season game where the Indianapolis Colts of Peyton Manning played the, let me see, I think it was the Green Bay Packers of Brett Favre. And as I seem to remember, I think like the corners in the Packers team or something were like injured, or one of them couldn't play or something. And so all Peyton Manning's team did, even though they had this massive skill set of offensive tools, that they had great receivers, good running back, even though they had all these good options that they could come up with that Peyton Manning could call on the fly, all they did in the initial parts of the game was attack the corners non-stop and look for mismatches there and create favorable matchups for themselves. That's what you do with good scouting. You don't just look for the opponent, see what he's not good at, and then try to do that even if you're not that good at it yourself. That's the key of what mTw does, and that's what I've seen Astralis in general doing as well. They can't always get the kills and they can't always win the round, but in general they're selecting the right places to go and the right way to attack. I mean, the best map to watch them do this on is the map they're the best in the world at the moment, Astralis. The T side on that map is immaculate for them. Just watch the way they play, and remember, when you watch the overview, they can't actually know where the opponent is. They can get info on it and they can make educated guesses, but the way they attack the sites, like when they decide to go to the B site, you'd almost think they had the overlay and the overview, and they could know that this guy hasn't rotated yet and Device has held someone off long, and so now we're going to attack here, we've rotated over. You'd almost think they did. That's how well they're playing out, because of the mixture of research, reading the game, and then making correct calls on what they wanted to do anyway. They've also, on the CT side, I mean, I don't know that they can get as good as mTw, because mTw had a lot of veterans, but they seem to have a pretty good comms-based rotation. Now, aside from games where Astralis still sometimes, it's not always that they choke, sometimes just look a little hesitant and afraid. In general, their rotations are pretty good based on the comms of knowing what the player at that site's going to do. Finally, both teams famously had amazing map pools. Even maps that they would lose on, they could at least play and compete on, and therefore beat the lesser teams on, maybe not the best team in the world on that map. So I actually think not only does Astralis contrast well with MTW, but they even are looking for a similar style of success, a similar kind of trajectory of success, because both teams won a major. Both teams have won multiple tournaments, but both teams are playing in an era that is among the most competitive era. I actually think that this year can be the most competitive ever in CSGO history. And 2008 was the most competitive, in my opinion, in Counter-Strike 1.6 history. So the interesting thing is, I actually think that you should expect similar types of success. Like, Astralis shouldn't win 4 tournaments in a row because it's so competitive, and there are good teams out there who, as a result of so many being good, inevitably will have a style of maps that they can beat Astralis on. But if you can do what MTW did, which is win a tournament every 2 or 3 tournaments, now you can be the best team of the year, you can be dominant in your own way and hard to beat, but you're not going to win every tournament, but you're still going to show, because you're one of the most competitive areas, that you're one of the best teams ever. And that's really the trajectory Astralis is on, much as MTW were back in 2008.